Squid Game has given us audiences plenty of nefarious characters, but one who could be said to be the most chilling so far despite his limited screen time is that of the recruiter. If the Squid Game is an avenue of death, then the recruiter is their grim reaper, serving to usher in the poor and innocent souls to an untimely demise. The director of Squid Game has stated that the show is an allegory of the competitiveness of modern society. And as per the recurring theme of the series, the wealthy have their enjoyment at the expense and exploitation of the poor, so it's somewhat consistent that the recruiter's actions are reflective of this notion. This theme is first seen with his choice of punishment meted out when the prospect fails to flip the paper, namely a slap to the face. While this slap might be necessary to inflict a relatively harmless punishment in their game, it's twofold in its possible meaning, whether it's an analogy of the harsh treatment of the poor by the rich, or a reflection of the recruiter's disdain for the prospective players he meets. The latter is confirmed in his second and final encounter with Gi-hoon when he expresses disgust at him and labels him as a piece of trash who got lucky enough to climb out of the dumpster. Coincidentally, it is this disgust that lies at the heart of the recruiter's self-justification in his dehumanization of his victims by labeling them as trash who are useless to society. He doesn't just condone their fate, he presents it as if it was a public service. Now, we all have beliefs in this world that influence how we see everything, and we often come across visual reminders that serve to reinforce our preconceived beliefs. For the recruiter, we find this reinforcement in what appears to be a hobby of his, namely his experiment of offering either bread or lottery to the homeless. No recruitment is derived from this activity, so we can assume that the recruiter is doing this on his own accord for his own leisure. Now, when faced with the choices of bread or lottery, it's the logical choice to choose the bread when considering the bird in hand theory. Choosing the bread is a guaranteed payoff, as opposed to the minuscule chance of winning the lottery. It's a testament to the optimism bias of human nature that we would think we would be more likely to experience the favorable outcome of any scenario, somewhat like the chain smoker who thinks that they're unlikely to get any lung-related diseases, or the gambler who persists in his gambling, fixated on one big payday despite incurring heavy losses. But whatever the thought process is behind it, most of the homeless chose the lottery, and this reinforces the recruiter's dehumanization of them as trash, who made the wrong decisions in life and therefore deserve their fate, which is why I believe that he undertakes this activity of his own will. It's a social experiment to confirm his worldview, and if you observe his microfacial expressions towards the homeless, there appears to be a tinge of disgust that escapes the pleasantries of a smiling countenance. He could have just left the place with the bread in hand, but he chose to rub salt in the wound and destroy the bread in plain view of them, coupled with gaslighting them that they were the ones responsible. As to why the recruiter despises the poor, perhaps it could be because he was one of them to begin with. If Squid Game 2 has shown us anything, it's that the crew members were also in dire straits before they went to the island. If so, then the recruiter's hatred of the poor is both a projection of his own shame over his past and an overcompensation to solidify his new identity as the rich. Or he may feel that since he managed to overcome his challenges, others should be able to do so as well, leading to a lack of empathy. But back to the recruiter's psychopathy. There is some overtly disturbing behavior displayed when he stomped on the bread and when he contorts his facial expression when he played Russian roulette, but a much stronger indicator would be his act of eliminating his father. The fact that the details are fuzzy to him, that he doesn't even remember the year it happened, suggests how inconsequential the event was to him. Having meaningful social bonds is one possible deterrent against criminal activity, but here we see the recruiter's lack of such a bond, especially one so vital with that of his father. From what little we know of the recruiter's past, we can surmise two things: that he was somewhat neglected in life, a notion implied when he expresses a celebratory satisfaction that he was finally noticed when he was promoted to wield a weapon. Second, he might have been struggling to find his place in society, which we get a hint of when he relishes the epiphany that he was cut out for the job of being a Squid Game crew member. Now, whether these two factors contributed to his psychopathy, we can only speculate. But suffice to say, they are not sufficient to account for his psychopathy, as there are millions of neglected and struggling people who still live morally upright lives. A lack of regard for the lives of others is abnormal enough, but the recruiter's psychopathy takes it further with a lack of regard for even his own life. He was willing to die to stay true to his worldview. And that kind of dedication makes him more disturbing than his counterparts in the Squid Game. Sure, people like the front man and the old man and the VIP clients are all evil in their own regard, but which of them could have such disregard for their own life that they would laugh in the face of death and readily embrace it? Despite the decreasing odds of survival in the game of Russian roulette, there is no hint of fear as he puts the medal to his head. Now, I don't think the recruiter resented the label of being the Squid Game's messenger or their dog. He seems to be quite fine with that identity and his place in life. At this point in the game, when it was a 50-50th probability between loaded and unloaded, we see the recruiter tempt Gi-hoon to break the rules and use the weapon on him. Personally, I believe at this point, the recruiter was attempting to goad Gi-hoon into cheating, at which point he would disarm Gi-hoon and use the weapon on him as a punishment for breaking the rules. What he didn't count on was the fact that Gi-hoon was himself nonchalant to the notion of death, and was also lucky enough to have an empty chamber. At this point, with only one chamber left, the recruiter's fate was sealed, except with the way out of himself breaking the rules. But for someone like himself, being an enforcer of the rules himself, this option is unacceptable. Breaking the rules would be shattering his self-image. Additionally, he would be silently admitting defeat to Gi-hoon, and given how he despises him and what he represents, this would be detrimental to his self-perception and therefore also unacceptable. Even if the recruiter were to win by cheating, it would still be effectively a defeat, and what's worse, to someone that he despises. In a way, this bears some resemblance to the death of Javert in Les Miserables, who also chose to end himself rather than have his self-identity compromised. And finally, there is the subject of luck. In the game of Russian roulette, as well as with many of the games in Squid Game, luck is the crucial determining factor in deciding the winner. As a former crew member, the recruiter must have noticed the importance of luck in deciding one's fate. So now, in his game of Russian roulette, his own luck has run out, and there is nothing for him to do save for accepting his fate. But perhaps it's here that the recruiter misses an important perspective. I'm sure he wouldn't argue that the people who survived the Squid Game were lucky. In fact, he labels Gi-hoon as a piece of trash who was lucky enough to leave the dumpster. But just like in the Squid Game, oftentimes success in real life can ultimately boil down to one crucial element: luck. Now, of course, many of the destitute people who ended up playing the Squid Game made deliberate poor choices of their own will, which they should take responsibility for. But at the same time, perhaps many of them had a bad starting hand. And if the recruiter was subject to the same circumstances as them, he might very well have ended up as one of the homeless people he despised. For a more thorough and convincing argument on the element of luck, check out Veritasium's video on the success paradox. But whether you may agree or disagree on the aspect of luck, the point remains that being a crew member of the Squid Game, the recruiter could have recognized the element of luck in his current state, and thus have been more compassionate to those who were less fortunate than him, instead of belittling them. But what do you think? And if you enjoyed this video, then you might want to check out my take on why some of Sung-woo's actions were justified in Season 1.